Okay, so in the emergency management world and in the emergency management field, one of the biggest benefits that you have is the ability to conduct what's called a gap analysis or a risk analysis for your local jurisdiction. What a gap analysis does is it actually gives you the data that Kim was referring to that schools have. It gives you the data to back up your need for the public safety community. The one thing to note about what data you find in a gap analysis is that this information is not going to be new to you. This will be very intuitive to you for your local jurisdiction. You already know what the issues, what the concerns, maybe what the natural hazards are that you face. But what a gap analysis does is it lets you define that for someone who is not familiar with your jurisdiction. When we talk about these grants and we talk about the competitive grant process, we talk about people who are reviewing and scoring these grants. They might not be intimately familiar with your area to know what those risks are that you face. For example, what happens in Evansville, Indiana, in terms of natural hazards that they might deal with is going to be vastly different than what you see in Fort Wayne, Indiana. For example, we all know southern Indiana tends to get more tornadoes than northern Indiana. So those are the kinds of things that we look at when we do a gap analysis. Tom, we're actually going to address that in the next couple slides about what exactly a hazard and a risk is. But yes, those are some ideas of what we're going to talk about. So going into that, identifying the hazard. For the purposes of a gap analysis, what I have up there in italics is actually the definition we're going to use for a hazard. It is a potential source of harm or adverse health effect on a person or persons. So this is that natural disaster. It's that tornado. It's that earthquake. Now, the other thing to know about hazards is that they can be synonymous with threats. Threats and hazards can be defined as two separate things or lumped together. A threat tends to be a man-made hazard. So a threat tends to be an act of terrorism, a bombing, any of those sort of man-made issues. Those are what we call threats. Hazards tend to be then more of the natural disaster scenarios. So earthquakes, tornadoes, fires, those tend to be what hazards are. But for the purposes of a gap analysis, you can put the two together and just lump them under the umbrella of what a hazard is. These are some areas where you can find hazards. Like I said, for most of you, this will be intuitive. You will know what threats or hazards your local jurisdiction faces. The key is documenting that. Some ideas on where you can get this information: hazard and vulnerability assessments, critical infrastructure lists. If you've had any critical infrastructure work done in your county or in your town, that can give you an idea of hazards you might face. And the last one there, recent incidents. I can tell you that in March of 2012, if you'll remember, that was when the Henryville tornado struck. And I can tell you in the months following Henryville, tornadoes was a huge piece of what everyone's thought went to when they thought about hazards in Indiana. Now, in the last couple of months, we've seen a shift towards more of the man-made disasters or the man-made issues. We've seen a shift where people are now focused on things like active shooters. So recent incidents can play into identifying the hazards that you face, but you need to keep it in perspective with what your jurisdiction faces on the grand scheme. So what they face day in and day out, not necessarily what the most recent incident was to prompt that. But it can help you round out your list of hazards and threats that you have identified. So some examples that I mentioned of these hazards, pandemic issues. We've had H1N1, we've had the swine flu issues, so pandemic can be a hazard that you're concerned about in your local jurisdiction. We talk about terrorism, bombing, active shooter, those are those threats I mentioned. And then we have issues like earthquakes, tornadoes, fires, those natural disasters that can be the hazards that you look to. So these are just some examples. This is obviously not an all-encompassing list, but this just gives you an idea of what to look at when we're discussing what a hazard is. The next step in a gap analysis, after you've identified the hazards that will impact your local jurisdiction, is look at your desired capabilities. What capabilities do you want to see enhanced in your local jurisdiction? USDHS and FEMA have a list called the Target Capabilities List. USDHS and FEMA has what they call a Target Capabilities List, which encompasses 37 of a broad range of capabilities that you can look to. We'll go over some examples of that in the next screen. But the other piece to think about when you're looking at what capabilities you want to enhance in your local jurisdiction through grant funds is what's at the bottom of the screen right here. You cannot neglect this. Elected and appointed officials define priorities. I think most of us in this field know that that's who's really going to make the ultimate decision about those funding choices. So you have to take that into account when you talk about the capabilities that you want to enhance in your local jurisdiction. These are some samples off of that Target Capabilities List that I mentioned that you maybe want to enhance in your local jurisdiction. Again, these are not all-encompassing, but this does give you a foundation to look towards for your gap analysis. You have things like Emergency Operations Center management and operations. You have things like incident management, interoperable communications. I can't tell you how many public safety organizations talk about their issues with interoperable communications, whether it's the actual physical equipment, like the radios that are used, or if it's things outside of that. So these are some examples of some capabilities you can look towards. So the next step in your gap analysis, we've identified the hazards and the threats that we face in our jurisdiction. We've looked towards and prioritized what capabilities we would like to see. Now it's time to kind of back that up with some statistics. So what you want to do is identify your risk. For this purpose, we're going to use the definition here. Risk is the likelihood that a person may be harmed if exposed to a hazard. This can get scary for some people, but this does not have to be detailed. This does not have to be some broad formula that you have to get all kinds of statistics involved with it. This can be as simple as a scale of 1 to 5. So the first piece we look at when we're identifying risk and we're calculating what this risk is the threat or the probability of something happening. So when we take that hazard that we identified, so for example, we'll look at a tornado. What we want to do is assign a numerical value between 1 and 5 on what the threat or the probability is of a tornado occurring in our jurisdiction. So for most of Indiana, that's probably going to be up there at like a 4. The next step you want to look at is your vulnerability or your susceptibility to that hazard. So again, for a tornado, this is going to be completely dependent on your jurisdiction. If you are in a very, very rural county if a tornado were to come through, it might not damage much in terms of people, but it might damage a lot in terms of fields or agriculture. All of that needs to be played into your specific vulnerability. Now, if a tornado came through the city of Indianapolis or the city of Evansville, the vulnerability or the susceptibility might be a little bit higher based on population. So you'll want to assign, again, a numerical value, 1 through 5, on what your specific vulnerability is to that hazard. The other thing to remember when you talk about vulnerability is what mitigation efforts you've already done. A lot of times people have mentioned flooding to us. Flooding has been a hazard for them. But in recent years, they've done a lot of mitigation efforts to maybe buy out the low-lying areas and the areas that are more vulnerable to the floods. So maybe their vulnerability isn't as high anymore when they talk about something like a flood. The last piece of identifying risk is then the consequence or the damage of that hazard. So when you talk about a tornado and you talk about the tornado going through Indianapolis, what's the consequence of that going to be for your jurisdiction? It would probably be catastrophic at that point. So you want to assign a number 1 through 5, again, based on your jurisdiction and based on your hazard for the consequence. So once we've identified all 3 of those and we have the numbers, it's just as simple as adding up all 3 of those numbers and taking the score out of 15. That is what is going to give you your list of risks. So you take each of those hazards you've identified, from fires to floods, active shooters, all of that can be applied to this risk formula. Again, this is not going to surprise any of you. You will see that the things you are prepared for, the things that you anticipate, are probably going to rank higher in your risk. So they will have the higher numbers, the 14s, the 15s. This shouldn't be a surprise to you because this is what's intuitive to you. The point is, we are backing up our grant proposals with data. We can show those people who might not be familiar with your county or your town what it is that you really face based on this data. So this is an example of identifying risk then with the capabilities. We've looked at the hazards, now let's look at the capabilities. We see in this jurisdiction where incident management, they have said that their risk of having to use incident management capability is a 5. It's the highest risk they have. But if we look at the next slide, their current capacity for incident management and where their current levels are at is at a 1. They have no ability to handle an incident management situation. So you can see, again, we're getting data to back up. Obviously, if they want to put in a grant proposal to beef up their incident management capabilities, maybe for more training, more equipment, then they've given us the data to back that up. They've shown us where they've done risk rankings. They've shown us where they've conducted a gap analysis to back that up. This is just a visual representation of the capacity where you're currently at versus the risk you've identified, and you can see where incident management, regional collaboration, and emergency operations center are at the higher end of their scale for their grant proposals. So these are some reference materials you can use, but the point being when we talk about a gap analysis is that it doesn't need to be elaborate. It doesn't need to be a long, drawn-out, expensive process. This is just something that allows you to put what you already know on paper. It allows you to justify why you are applying for those grant funds. One of the biggest areas that you can really benefit from this is with after-action reports. If you have after-action reports that have identified certain capabilities maybe that need to be strengthened, then you can use that as a basis for your gap analysis. So if we have any questions on the gap analysis process, that was a very brief overview, but we have more information than that if you need it. Christy asked, can we pull the data from our multi-hazard mitigation plan? Absolutely, Christy. That is a great resource to use. IDHS also has a statewide threat and hazard risk assessment, the THIRA, that they published, I believe, in 2010 or 2011. That is available through the IDHS planners if you have not seen a copy of that. And it identified the top threats and hazards for the entire state of Indiana and their rankings. So if you would like a copy of that, we can put you in touch with the right people to get a copy of that. But any of those kind of data mining documents you have, multi-hazard mitigation plans, any threat and hazard assessments, all of those can come into play. When you talk about the time frame of the data, it doesn't really matter, but the more relevant, the better. Because this, again, goes to the people who are going to be reading the grant proposals. If you're using data from 30 years ago, obviously that's not going to be as relevant as data from 10 years ago. So in the big nature of things, it's not going to be a huge deal with how old the data is, but just keep in mind that those who are viewing the grant probably won't want to read things that are 30 or 50 years old. Okay. All right, and Rachel is actually working on, she will let you know what the contact info for the Ideas Just Planners is, so you can get a copy of that FIRA document. Okay. And these are some other reference materials you can use to look up risk, hazards, and the gap analysis through FEMA. FEMA and USDHS has a wealth of information on this. So if you ever need any help or ever want to look to any of that, they are a wealth of knowledge with it. So with that, we are actually going to take about a 10-minute break. We understand everyone's sitting at their desk, but we're going to let you stretch your legs. So we are actually going to pause the video and the audio for the next 10 minutes. We will come back at 10:10. Please don't log out. Please leave your screen up. And at 10:10, we will get started once again. We will still be moderating the chat, so if you think of any questions in the 10-minute break, well, again,
Stop sharing.
oh, there we go.